When an illegal Mexican immigrant cop pulls over the Secretary of the Defense Department of the United States, Pete Hegseth, he thinks his anti-Trump police captain will make him a sergeant. Instead, he ends up in an immigration court. But before we dive into that, let me know where you guys are watching from. Now let's take it from the beginning. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, a molten orb bleeding orange into the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked asphalt of Highway 89. Officer Miguel Alvarez stood beside his cruiser, the day's heat still radiating from the hood despite the creeping dusk. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, the lenses reflecting the endless stretch of sand and scrub brush that flanked the road. His crisp police uniform, navy blue, starched to perfection, clung to his sweat-soaked back, the fabric chafing against his skin after hours under the relentless sun. At 34, Miguel carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd earned his place, his badge gleaming like a polished talisman on his chest. The day had been uneventful, routine speeding tickets handed out to distracted truckers, a lost tourist in a rental car squinting at a crumpled map, nothing worth a second thought. But beneath the monotony, a restless energy simmered. Born in Nogales, Mexico, Miguel's earliest memory was of crossing into the U.S., a small boy cradled in his mother's trembling arms under a moonless sky. The desert had been a black void then, punctuated only by the rustle of coyotes and the crunch of gravel underfoot as they slipped past the border. His mother's whispered prayers had mingled with the night air, a desperate plea for a new life. That was decades ago, 27 years to be exact, and the memory had faded into a dull ache he rarely acknowledged. Now, he was an American cop, a guardian of the law he'd once evaded, patrolling the same arid expanse that had once swallowed him whole. The irony wasn't lost on him. It gnawed at the edges of his mind like a persistent desert wind, but he buried it deep, beneath layers of duty and discipline. A sudden roar shattered the stillness. A black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, sleek and predatory, tearing down the highway at a reckless clip. Dust swirled in its wake, a gritty cloud that stung Miguel's eyes as he squinted at the speed gun. 87 in a 65 zone. His jaw tightened. He flipped on the cruiser's lights, red and blue slicing through the twilight, and the siren wailed. A sharp cry that echoed off the distant mesas. The luxury car slowed with a grudging reluctance, its tires crunching onto the gravel shoulder, kicking up pebbles that pinged against the undercarriage. Miguel stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, his hand resting casually on the holster at his hip, a habit born of training, not threat. He approached the driver's side, the tinted window descending with a faint hum, revealing the man inside. There, in the leather-clad cockpit, sat a figure exuding authority even in repose. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, his salt and pepper beard trimmed razor sharp, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the desert's rugged sprawl. Miguel recognized him instantly. Former Fox News host, Trump's hand-picked enforcer, a man whose face had glared from countless TV screens. Hegseth's steely gaze locked onto Miguel's, unblinking, a predator sizing up prey. The air between them crackled, thick with unspoken challenge. "License and registration," Miguel said, voice steady. Hegseth smirked, reaching for his wallet. "You know who I am, officer? I don't care who you are. You were speeding. License and registration." Hegseth handed over the documents, his smirk fading into a thin line. "You're a real stickler, huh? What's your name?" "Officer Alvarez. Step out of the vehicle, sir." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Hegseth's jaw tightened. "Excuse me? You heard me. Outside now." Hegseth complied, stepping onto the asphalt with deliberate slowness, his 6 feet 2 inches frame towering over Miguel's compact build. The desert wind tugged at his suit jacket. "You're making a mistake, Alvarez. I'm on official business." "Official business doesn't mean breaking the law," Miguel snapped, glancing at the license. 22 over the limit. That's reckless driving. Hands on the hood. Hegseth laughed, a sharp, incredulous bark. "You're kidding me. Do you have any idea what I do? Who I answer to?" "I don't answer to DC. I answer to the law. Hands on the hood." The secretary's face darkened, but he complied, palms slapping the Mercedes hood. Miguel patted him down, finding nothing but a phone and a set of keys. The tension crackled like static. Hegseth turned his head slightly, voice low. "You're digging your own grave, officer. I'll have your badge." For this, Miguel stepped back, unfazed. "Threaten me all you want. I've heard worse. You're getting a citation." Hegseth straightened, brushing off his sleeves. "You're a cocky one. Where you from, Alvarez?" "Here. Arizona?" "No, I mean originally." His tone dripped with insinuation. Miguel's pulse quickened, but his face remained stone. "That's irrelevant. Sign here." He thrust the ticket forward. Hegseth scribbled his signature, eyes never leaving Miguel's. "We'll see about that." He slid back into the Mercedes, engine purring to life, and peeled away, leaving Miguel in a cloud of dust. 2 days later, Miguel's radio crackled mid-shift. "Alvarez, report to the station, now." The captain's voice was clipped, urgent. Miguel frowned, turning his cruiser toward town. When he arrived, Captain Torres, a grizzled veteran with a soft spot for Miguel, was waiting in his office. Door closed. "Sit," Torres said, avoiding eye contact. Papers littered his desk, some stamped with federal seals. "What's this about, Cap?" Torres sighed, sliding a file across the desk. "ICE. They're asking questions about you. Your status." Miguel's stomach dropped. "My status? I'm a citizen. Naturalized 10 years ago." "Are you?" Torres's voice was quiet, pained. "Because they've got records. Border Patrol logs from '98. A woman and a kid crossing near Sasabe. No papers, no entry stamp." Miguel's mouth went dry. "That's ancient history. I've got a passport, a badge." "Doesn't matter," Torres cut in. "They're saying your naturalization was fraudulent, based on a lie. Hegseth's office pushed this, Miguel. He's got pull with DHS. Hegseth?" Miguel's fists clenched. "The guy I ticketed?" Torres nodded grimly. "Secretary of Defense doesn't like being embarrassed. He's calling it a national security risk and illegal wearing a badge, pulling over cabinet members. ICE is coming for you." The hearing was set for a week later in a Phoenix immigration court. Miguel stood in his dress uniform, badge polished, flanked by a pro bono lawyer named Carla Ruiz. The room buzzed with murmurs. Reporters, locals, a few protesters waving back the blue signs. At the prosecution table sat an ICE attorney, a wiry man named Kessler, and beside him, Pete Hegseth himself, arms crossed, radiating smug satisfaction. Judge Ellen Harper presided, her silver hair pulled tight, gavel resting like a loaded gun. "This is an expedited removal proceeding for Miguel Alvarez," she began, voice crisp. "Mr. Kessler, your opening." Kessler stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the respondent entered the United States illegally in 1998 at age 7 with his mother, Maria Alvarez. No lawful entry was recorded. His subsequent naturalization in 2015 relied on falsified documentation. Under INA, Section 212(6)AI, he's deportable. The Secretary of Defense present today has elevated this case due to the respondent's position as a law enforcement officer, a role he obtained under false pretenses." The gallery stirred. Carla rose, her voice firm. "Your Honor, Officer Alvarez has served this country honorably for over a decade. He was a child when he crossed, brought by his mother. His naturalization was processed in good faith. This is a political hit job." Judge Harper's eyes flicked to Hegseth. "Mr. Secretary, you've requested to speak. Proceed." Hegseth stood, buttoning his jacket, his baritone filling the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm here because this man," he pointed at Miguel, "abused his authority, harassed a cabinet official, and endangered national security. He's not just an illegal, he's a fraud wearing a badge. I pulled over for a routine stop, and he treated me like a criminal. This isn't about politics, it's about integrity." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. Carla whispered, "Stay calm. We've got this." Harper leaned forward. "Officer Alvarez, your testimony." Miguel stood, shoulders squared. "Your Honor, I've lived here since I was 7. I graduated high school, joined the force, and swore an oath to uphold the law. I pulled over Mr. Hegseth because he was speeding. 87 in a 65. No favoritism, no harassment. Just my job." Hegseth snorted audibly. Harper shot him a warning glance before addressing Kessler. "Evidence?" Kessler slid a folder across the bench. "Border Patrol logs, 1998. A woman and child apprehended near Sasabe, released with a notice to appear." "They never did. The mother's fingerprints match Maria Alvarez. Deceased 2010. The child's description matches the respondent." Carla countered, "Your Honor, those logs are vague. Height, weight, no photo. My client applied for citizenship legally. The government approved it. This is selective enforcement." Hegseth interjected, voice sharp. "Selective? He's an illegal who slipped through the cracks. You think I'd let some border jumper lecture me about the law?" "Enough," Harper snapped, gavel banging. "Mr. Secretary, you're not counsel. Sit down." Miguel's heart pounded. He'd known the risks, his mother's whispered warnings, the forged papers she'd paid for, but he'd buried them under years of service. Now they were clawing to the surface. The hearing stretched into hours. Carla presented character witnesses. Captain Torres, a schoolteacher, a neighbor, all vouching for Miguel's integrity. Kessler countered with technicalities, the lack of an entry stamp, the expired notice to appear. Hegseth sat silently, smirking, as if the outcome was preordained. Then came the twist. Carla stood holding a thumb drive. Your Honor, we have new evidence. Audio from Officer Alvarez's body cam during the stop, Kessler objected. This wasn't disclosed in discovery. It surfaced yesterday, Carla shot back. It's exculpatory. The court must hear it. Harper nodded. Play it. The clerk inserted the drive. Static crackled, then Miguel's voice. License and registration. Hegseth's reply. You know who I am, officer? The exchange unfolded. Calm. Professional on Miguel's end. Escalating to Hegseth's threat. I'll have your badge for this. The gallery murmured. Harper's brow furrowed. Mr. Secretary, you threatened an officer during a lawful stop? Hegseth shifted, face reddening. I was asserting my rights. He had no business. He had every business, Harper cut in. You were speeding. He followed protocol. Kessler jumped in. Your Honor, this doesn't change his immigration status. It changes motive, Carla interjected. This case isn't about security. It's revenge. Hegseth exploded, standing. Revenge? This is about justice. He's an illegal playing cop. I won't let him hide behind a badge he doesn't deserve. Sit down, Harper's gavel slammed. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Hegseth sat, fuming. Miguel met his glare, unflinching. The hearing pivoted to closing arguments. Kessler leaned hard on the law. No lawful entry, no valid citizenship. Deportation is mandatory. Carla countered with equity. He's an asset to this country, not a threat. Punishing him now is unjust. Harper recessed to deliberate. The room buzzed with tension. Miguel sat rigid, Carla's hand on his shoulder. Hegseth whispered to Kessler, smirking again. 30 minutes later, Harper returned. This is a difficult case, she began. Officer Alvarez has served admirably, but the law is clear. His entry was unlawful, and his naturalization rests on that flawed foundation. I have no discretion here. Removal is ordered. The gallery gasped. Carla slumped. Hegseth's smirk widened into a grin. Miguel stood, voice steady. Your Honor, I respect the law, but Mr. Hegseth pushed this because I did my job. That's the truth. Harper's eyes softened, but her ruling stood. I'm sorry, officer. ICE will take custody. The aftermath was swift. Outside the courthouse, ICE agents waited, badges glinting in the sun. Miguel stepped out in his uniform, hands cuffed behind him. A crowd gathered, some shouting support, others jeering. Captain Torres approached, face ashen. I'll fight this, Miguel. We all will. Don't, Miguel said quietly. It's done. An agent grabbed his arm, tugging at his uniform. Strip it off. You don't get to wear that. Miguel's eyes blazed, but he complied, unbuttoning the shirt he'd worn with pride. The badge clattered to the pavement. The crowd fell silent as he stood in a white undershirt, cuffed, vulnerable. Hegseth emerged, adjusting his cufflinks, nodding to the agents. Good work! Send him back where he belongs! But karma moves fast. As Miguel was led to the van, a reporter rushed forward, mic outstretched. Mr. Secretary, what about the body cam audio? You threatened an officer, any comment? Hegseth waved her off, climbing into his Mercedes. The engine roared, too loud. A plume of smoke erupted from the hood. He stepped out, cursing, as a tow truck arrived. The crowd laughed, phones recording. 3 days later, Miguel stood on the dusty edge of Nogales, Mexico, just beyond the rusted border fence that sliced the landscape in two. Deported, stripped of his uniform, he wore a faded gray t-shirt and jeans borrowed from a cousin he hadn't seen since childhood. The sun blazed overhead, baking the cracked earth beneath his boots, and a hot wind carried the faint tang of diesel and sagebrush. He stared north, across the invisible line he'd once crossed as a boy, his dark eyes tracing the shimmering horizon where Arizona blurred into a haze. His badge was gone, his home confiscated, his life uprooted, but the fire in his chest burned brighter than ever. Resolve wasn't a thing they could deport. Back in Phoenix, the fallout was electric. The body cam video, grainy but damning, had exploded online, racking up millions of views within hours. It showed Hegseth's Mercedes stalled on the courthouse curb, smoke billowing from the hood. His tailored suit crumpled as he kicked the tire in a fit of rage, swearing loudly enough for bystanders to flinch. Juxtaposed against it was Miguel, standing tall as ICE agents peeled the uniform from his shoulders, his face a mask of quiet dignity even as the cuffs clicked shut. The contrast was viral gold. Hashtags like #Justice for Miguel and #Hegseth Hypocrisy trended nationwide. Protests erupted outside the Phoenix ICE office. Hundreds of voices, from cops in solidarity to immigrants waving American flags, chanting for his reinstatement. Signs read, "A badge doesn't lie," and "Deport corruption, not heroes." Captain Torres led the charge, his weathered face on every news channel vowing to appeal. "Miguel's one of us," he told reporters, voice cracking. Hegseth abused his power, plain and simple. In Washington, D.C., the Secretary of Defense's triumph unraveled faster than a cheap suit. Leaked emails surfaced, courtesy of an anonymous whistleblower at DHS, terse exchanges where Hegseth had leaned on ICE brass, demanding priority handling of Miguel's case. "No illegals in uniform," he'd written, bypassing protocol with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. Senators from both parties pounced. Committee chairs scheduled hearings, their statements dripping with outrage. "This isn't law enforcement, it's a vendetta." Cable news ran the story on loop, clips of Hegseth's roadside tantrum interspersed with pundits dissecting his overreach. His victory, once smugly assured, soured into a public relations nightmare. Colleagues distanced themselves and whispers of resignation grew louder. Miguel, meanwhile, stood on a Nogales street corner, watching it all unfold on a borrowed phone with a cracked screen. A street vendor's radio blared mariachi nearby and kids kicked a deflated soccer ball down an alley. The news app refreshed. Another protest, another leaked memo, another senator demanding accountability. He'd lost everything. His badge, his apartment, the life he'd built brick by brick. But not his fight. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't just a judge's gavel or a courtroom ruling. It was a shield, forged in the courage of those who stood against the storm. He pocketed the phone, squinting north again. Someday, somehow, he'd wield it once more. On this side of the border or the other, the law had cast him out, but the truth hadn't. And truth, like the desert sun, had a way of burning through the shadows.